All right, let's get rolling with this. Good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Schleifer. I am the Director of Development and Partnerships at CIPE, the Center for International Private Enterprise, and I would like to welcome you to this morning's webinar. This is the third in a series of events organized jointly by Duff Phelps and CIPE, looking at the role that ESG will play in post-pandemic recovery. CIPE extends our deepest thanks to Duff Phelps, and particularly our board member, Nicole Lamb-Hale, who's with Duff Phelps, for this great partnership in organizing these fascinating discussions. Our first event was a big picture snapshot of ESG issues in a post-COVID world. And then that was in the fall. All of these events are available if you'd like to go back and find them either on Duff Phelps' website or CIPE's website for viewing. Our second event, we looked at these issues in Central and Eastern Europe and Eurasia. And today we are going to be examining Latin America and the Caribbean. We're very lucky today to have my colleague Michele, Crymes, one of the program officers in CIPE's anti-corruption and governance team, serving as our moderator. Our speakers are Alexandre Pierantoni, Managing Director and Head of Brazil Corporate Finance at Duff Phelps, John Zemko, Regional Director for Latin America and the Caribbean at CIPE, and from one of CIPE's outstanding partner organizations in Mexico, we have Senior Researcher Ana Lila Moreno from the organization Mexica Evalua. In the interest of time, we won't read our panelists' full bios, but rather I'll soon pass it over to Michele to begin the conversation. Please note that we are offering a Spanish language audio feed today. Unfortunately, not trilingual. We don't have Portuguese as well, but you can see the interpretation at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to switch languages. Please feel free to submit questions in the Q&A box. Excuse me, Q&A box. The chat functionality is turned off, but if you put your questions in the Q&A, we'll pass them on to the panel. And you are welcome to submit questions in English, Spanish, or Portuguese. So with no further ado, I'll pass it on to you, Michele, to kick us off. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mark, for that really great introduction. I'm really happy to be discussing this topic with everyone. Part of my portfolio here at CIPE is working on projects that have to do with compliance, and ESG is, of course, one of the areas of compliance that we work on. So I'd like to start today by talking about with my first question, which is just a really, I think, general question, but I think it will help sort of set the tone and help everyone understand what it is that we're talking about. So that first question is, what does ESG mean? Alexandre, would you mind answering for us first?
Yes, thank you, Michele. Thank you for the invitation to be here today, to all of you in this panel. I would say ESG is for sure in the heart today, right? And will continue to be for the long term for corporations, investors, and governances and multilateral agencies, right? Managing and investing in ESG all over the world, and this is not only Europe, US, Latin America, right? Is on top of mind of the C-suite. And I believe given what we are seeing in terms of effects of climate change, the pandemic, the social impacts, the focus on ESG have been renewed. So the business community and more broadly, the public alike will pay attention. I believe, again, the momentum about talking about environmental issues, about social issues and governance is building up stronger, right? And companies will be evaluated about how they behave during the pandemic. Definitely the pandemic has accelerated a lot of investments and views in terms of technology, logistics, and social behavior. But I believe corporate issues and how the companies are performing in all sectors, not necessarily the ones included in consumer products, right? But also on mining, on oil and gas, on retail, are going to be seeing the future about how they performed during these last months and probably the next ones, even with the vaccines coming up. I am sure ESG has accelerated not only in terms of when you look about debt markets or capital markets, in terms of IPOs and follow-ons, and I'm talking particularly about Brazil that's experienced a boom in terms of IPOs and follow-ons and companies going public, but how the whole investors and C-suite are going to be analyzed by this transformational, I would say, impact that ESG has in the operations. I believe, and then trying to sum up here a few factors, investors are still being educated and learning how to evaluate on a long term the investments that the companies and the executives are doing today in these three topics, just to mention the ESG ones. I believe the alignment of the government policies and regulators with the business community is going to drive the next trends of investments. And I believe taking the risks, right, anticipating consumers and demands aligned with ESG terms are going to be important from now on. They are already important, but are going to be much more important for now on. For some countries, particularly, Michele, I believe, and I being here present in Latin America, particularly in Brazil, where we have a lot of natural resources, right, to be explored. And then the environmental point is a strong aspect. We are a global exporter of fruits, of meat. So all the environmental and social impacts are very well balanced nowadays here in Brazil. I believe it's going to be another challenge, right? We are sure that many regions and countries have challenges, right? They have to be, in my view, more aligned. And I believe there is going to be a more standardized measurement and disclosure of ESG terms around the globe, so we can better evaluate and benchmark the companies, the governments, and the regulations. So that's my first view, Michele, about how I see ESG playing their role today, how important it is to make it now. The momentum, I'm sure with the Biden administration, there's going to be a new momentum for that. But I believe it's not only one government, but the whole environment that we are living today and how it's affecting today the companies.
Great, and thank you for that answer. I think one of the things that makes this event useful right now is one of the things you brought up, that investors are still learning, right? And that's the part of the reason why we are here today. So I'm wondering, John, Anna, if you have sort of a different perspective on what ESG means, particularly in countries where you both work, where there are state-owned industries. And I wonder if you could give us perhaps a little bit different take on what ESG might mean in that context. Enterprises, not industries.
If I could just jump in for 1 second with apologies to the panel. We understand we're having some technical difficulties with the Spanish language feed. We're working on getting that fixed, but please, there we go. I think we're good. Okay, please go on. Apologies.
Thank you, Anna or John, if you'd like to respond.
Sure, I'll jump into the fray. Thank you very much, Michele, for moderating this discussion, and thanks to my colleagues on the panel for the opportunity to join in this interesting conversation. I certainly agree with everything that Alex, has said, and this is an interesting area of development. I think it's important to realize that the E, the S, and the G and ESG are all rather different areas. And they're not all necessarily moving at the same pace, and they're not necessarily all viewed the same way, although we do talk about them as a group. I would say right now, the E, when you look at surveys of investors, and largely I would say ESG is being driven, ESG standards and the development of standards are being driven by investors in markets. The E is definitely a high priority item. I mean, a lot of attention is being focused on the environmental aspects, but the pandemic, I think, has really brought out a lot more strongly the social aspects, the S component, because that's the part that's been largely affected by the pandemic: human capital, and the role of stakeholders in the process of deciding company strategy. The G part of it is probably the area that we at CIPE have the most experience, the governance issues. That's been, I think, much more developed over the long term. But also I would say that that's probably been affected the least by the pandemic, maybe because for the past 20 years, we've been working on these issues, of governance, and how boards are composed, the independence of directors and the various issues that relate to what we call corporate governance. I think the G components are addressed in a rather different way, perhaps by an ESG audience, and maybe that's expanding a little bit beyond the traditional corporate governance bounds. But I think it's important that each of these components can be subdivided and looked at separately. So maybe Anna, you have some other perspectives on this from the state-owned enterprise perspective.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Michele and Alex. It's very nice to be here today with you sharing these insights. I would like to point out a bit about state-owned companies, backing a bit what John mentioned, but pointing out that state-owned companies are a bit different from private companies in this sphere, because they face higher risks. And one of these is the distinction between public policies and the value generation, or the drivers that are on which these companies are based on. And mainly these companies are gaining a lot of presence in the world. According to the OECD, they represent 1/4 of the major global companies in the world. And particularly the energy SOEs, they accumulate 40% of the energy capitalization in the world. So what is the risk behind the ESG factor for SOEs? We believe from Mexico Evalúa, we have been analyzing it since 3 years ago, approximately. And we find that there is a great risk, for example, in the transition to this ESG component regarding public finances. For example, these petrostates like Mexico, which rely a lot on the oil income, and the impacts that emerge from this exploitation and the refining of oil. Sometimes they pose different incentives regarding ESG. Some states who perform a role as owners, but also as regulators and public policy makers, face different incentives, and sometimes this yields in resistance to adopting the ESG methodologies or the ESG parameters. And as long as ESG is not a mandatory rule for accounting purposes, we have found cases in which there is a strong resistance to adopting them because of the risk they pose for their shareholders, the stakeholders, and sometimes very strong political forces, because state-owned companies also face a very high risk of political interference in their corporate boards, as well as great risks for corruption and for transparency and accountability. So each one of these components, the E, the S, and the G, pose different challenges for SOEs companies, which states have to endorse if they want to collaborate with this global effort.
Michele, do you allow me one comment on Anna's speech? Because it's so timely that I want to leverage on that. It's so good one. About when she speaks about the public companies and the infrastructure, right? What we have to have in mind, and this is global, it's not only LATAM, but she's precisely correct when she mentions about some LATAM perspective, right, about Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, and Argentina particularly, is about our whole community globally is structured and has huge investments in the past, right, to create products, demands, right, and offer services and infrastructure and everything like that, that have required investments that need to pay off, right? And they were 15 or 20 years ago not planned, right, or created with the ESG alignment, right? So this is a challenge that I believe, as you mentioned, we are here to educate and to learn, right? But this is a challenge that everyone has to shift the mind, right? And this is going to take some time for sure for us as executives and regulators and governors and investors, right? To take this new approach, right? And create demand for, let's call ESG aligned demand, right? So I believe the point that Ana raised about the public companies, and we do here in Brazil, have a lot of that in several sectors, right? Is very important, not only from the corruption, but also from the investment side and returns for the community and for the government and for investors also that are key in any company. But I believe is the change of mind when you think about ESG. So your question, what says ESG, is different for each word. John mentioned correctly about each of them are at different levels, right? I was seeing a research that environmental points, the senior executives feel more comfortable about the metrics. But when you talk about the social and the governance, they're not so comfortable. They need to improve. They know they need to improve. But I believe the whole mindset about we have a world, a business and living world that was created with one mindset, and we are now seeing an urgent need to change that, right, with, let's say, an ESG perspective. So this affects not only the way we approach the subject, but how we remunerate, and I'm thinking here about investors, this effort. So, and this, in my view, is a long-term investment.
Great. And since you sort of talked about the fact that it's a long-term investment, I'd like to sort of maybe connect some of those points. I think John's really critical point, that all of the factors sort of move differently. And then your point that we're aligned.
That's it.
And so I wonder if we could talk a little bit about what we see some of the long-term value being, especially, for example, in the Latin American and Caribbean region. What would be, in theory, the eventual payoff for being able to sort of align all of these criteria in terms of compliance?
I can start on that maybe with a couple of remarks, Michele. I think that there's a huge opportunity right now for companies to take the lead on these topics, on defining ESG. I mean, it's predominantly voluntary at this point, and through participation in defining, the standards by which ESG will be measured, I think there's a huge opportunity for companies to define this field and move it forward. Of course, the risk to them is that regulators might come in and decide to define it for them, either for better or worse. I think that on the whole, they're best off. I think board members, boards of directors, should see to moving on these topics. And it seems, if you look at the surveys of corporate directors, it seems in fact that a majority of them do think that they need to, number one, take more risk factors into their planning, their risk models for the company, and define it more in terms of company strategy, but then also to broaden the ESG framework that they are participating in and helping to define. Because a lot of this right now is about reporting and finding the right channels for reporting, finding the right measures to report on. And I think to the extent that the pandemic has forced them to look at these things a little bit more, I think it can really move the dial quite a bit. And just a word on the state-owned enterprise aspect. State-owned enterprises are not necessarily motivated by the same commercial or investor interests that that private companies are. So that investor component, that investor influence driving the need to define these terms under which companies would be measured is less present. So that's why it's really important, the governance models that we use for state-owned enterprises are important for driving more investor pressure on the companies. And also the fact that state-owned enterprises are largely clustered in particularly areas where the environmental impact is great, in energy, natural resources. That's where the largest concentration of those types of state-owned enterprises are. It's really important to help them and to push them to define these areas for the better.
Great, thank you for that, John. I wonder if maybe we can think a little bit about, well, before I move on, I'd like to remind anyone who has questions to please submit your questions using the Q&A function. We'll move on to questions in a bit, and Ed would be happy to have the panel here to answer any questions that you have. And so having made that a small announcement, and I wonder, did you have something else you wanted to add on to John's comments?
Yes, I would like to recall one of the latest industry reports that Sustainalytics published recently, and it came into my mind a phrase that I would like to share with you, and it's about the reliability of adopting an ESG standard. And Sustainalytics says that there is no business or fiduciary case for failing to make investments more sustainable. There is now evidence about there is no trade-off between sustainable investing and financial returns. And I like that very much, because in the past we had this doubt about the trade-off, whether we should invest on sustainable projects, or should we face or concentrate our efforts on profitability for maximizing the shareholder value. And the stakeholder capitalism has these components mixed. So this advantage comes to, for example, to Latin American states to evaluate whether their pension funds or their sovereign funds can be posed or can be present a conditional terms to their investors for presenting strong ESG parameters. So in that sense, states can put example and the tone in the financial markets for establishing valuable incentives for pushing the willingness of the companies to adopt better standards in terms of environmental and social impacts. Of course, governance as well, in terms of corruption mainly. So I think that adopting this standard is a matter of incentives, and it's a matter of trusting that there is no trade-off between investing in sustainable projects and standards and profitability and value creation.
Michele, do you allow me one comment again? It's good to see that I'm very aligned with Ana here, because I believe, and she's in Mexico, I'm in Brazil, and we almost have the same challenges, right? When we see things about government-owned companies, the governance place in the country and how we are acting. It's really not a trade-off. I have to agree with her. Otherwise, you are not going to be competitive. Eventually, you're not going to be alive, right? As a business, right? So, and it's not only addressing, as John said, right, one of the letters, so the E, S, or the G, right? But you have to sum up, right, and come with a standard and at least regular, right, score in any of them, right? And you have to be like that to be competitive. when you think about the mining sector, when you think about the oil and gas sector that the region is very strong in with, right? These are critical sectors in the environmental aspect. And this is why the region is highlighted, right, worldwide when it comes to topics about environmental. So we have not only to measure and improve how we address the points, but how the companies and the governments, right, market this so people is aware of how you do. I believe another point that's very important is we don't have to be ready to react, but you have to plan in advance, right? How you are going to address these points and how address problems that are going to be raised eventually, right? When you have problems. And in industries like I was mentioning, right? Although everyone is aware of risks that such industries may have particular risks, right? The effects of having a problem in Brazil, right, or in Mexico, or in Uruguay, or in Australia, right, are going to be felt by the investor all over the world. So the impact not only in the state, in the region, or in the country, or the investors that are living in Brazil, as an example, but all over the world is going to be a long-term impact in terms of problems if you have in such areas.
Great. Those are some really, I think, important perspectives to have to sort of help us understand sort of the incentives and the drivers for ESG, and particularly where we're seeing more movement at the moment, which is maybe environmental, but also governance, right? As John has pointed out for us because of the pandemic. I'm wondering if we could we've talked a lot of sort of about ideas and sort of what we all understand ESG to mean and to be, but I wonder if there are any examples that any of you can think of that might help for anyone in the audience to sort of understand what the impact of either maybe lack of compliance might look like, or really what great compliance might look like, so that someone could have an example to draw on.
Can I take the first one here?
Yeah.
No, and it's not lack of, but I believe are good and global examples, right? I'm telling nothing new here. BHP and Vale and Samarco, these are three big global mining companies, had problems with dams here in Brazil, right? And it's not a lack of governance, of environmental aspects, of the social impact, because all these companies and investors, they are aware about the risks of this operation, about how the challenge it is, and how big are the impacts of any disasters that these operations may have. But these companies, right, they're very well known. Mariana, that's a city in the interior of Minas Gerais here in Brazil. They have a disaster with a dam in 2015. Samarco, that was the operator, is owned by BHP and Vale. Then in 2018, we had another dam disaster with Brumadinho. That was a big dam disaster, and this affected the population, this affected investors, the states, and this resulted in agreements between the states and the companies. Just to mention one I have here in mind, it was signed last month. It's a $6 billion agreement between the government and the company to address the problems that were eventually created. And this is not a question of just signing the agreement, but how it impacts on a long run the company, the operations, and the community. I believe this, again, is not lack of governance, it's not lack of environmental worries. The companies are aware, the investors are aware, but even if you do everything all right, you still have the damage. Right? That's the point, and it's not only on ESG, it is our day-to-day, right? You have to do every time the right thing, right? You cannot miss one time because you are going to be recollected, right? Even if you try to put again back in place, right, the situation, right, that eventually you could not do the precise 100% thing on that point. So I believe this is something that we are still learning, right, about how can you do better, and even if you have something that you have operations that are high risk, right, that how you manage that, because I'm sure, right, that as an investor, even if you have an agreement and you compensate the state and the municipality for the money issue, right, there are other impacts that you have to be as better as prepared to address. So again, it's not a lack, right, of it, but how do you plan? How do you anticipate? And I believe companies, investors, and CEOs are very worried about how to be better and presented to address this issue and showing that we are worried about doing things as better as they can.
Great, and thank you for pointing out that it's not lack, right? That it's just figuring out how we move forward with the issues.
That's it, because they are worried. I'm sure, Michele, I put myself on these shoes. I am worried, right? So there is definitely no lack. Is correct. How can we do better?
That's perfect. I wonder if Anna or John, Anna, please go right ahead.
Yeah, I would like to share with our audience, especially those that are getting to know what is ESG, the ESG standard, that before this wave became the topic that we are talking about today, there have been in the past a lot of efforts for quantifying environmental, social, and governance impacts. And there are a lot of methodologies in the market. The market is composed by specialists that perform evaluations on ESG standards, and there are a lot of methodologies on this. And the last year, before the pandemic took the main topics and conversations in the global sphere, the World Economic Forum had in its main intention for 2020 to pose the ESG standard conversation and the intention to reach a common agreement on how to measure these standards. And this initiative was endorsed by a lot of accounting firms like Deloitte and PwC, EY, the major ones in the world. And with the IFRS, the global standard of global principles for accounting, for getting an homogeneous methodology so that all the companies in the world can adopt it. So as of today, we are expectant on the final outcome of this, and because it will be a norm. It is not a fad. It is norm. It will be a norm, and the voluntary willingness of companies to adopt it will reach an end, so that compliance offices will adopt it as a new mandatory standard. So as an example of this, how will it work? For example, in terms of SOEs, I would like to remark the example that France is posing. For example, for its energy SOEs like Électricité de France, which is adopting very ambitious goals for transition, for adopting renewable investments instead of fossil fuel investments for electricity generation. That is an example of how a state that can be an owner of productive companies can adopt this standard from the highest level of the political power, so that incentives are posed for SOEs and all the industry, and in terms of posing an example to other states. That is an example I would like to share. On the contrary, there are governments like Mexican government, for example, that are reluctant to adopting this, and they are changing the political policy for blocking the adoption of renewable projects, for example, in terms of defending fossil fuels and all the interest groups or stakeholders that are interested in not transitioning to a cleaner standard. So in terms of accountability, if ESG is adopted as a mandatory standard, companies will be forced to implement clean energies, for example, in terms of increasing the value they are interested to yield to investors in the financial markets. And that is the valuable thing about this ESG standard, that it will change the way we see non-financial risks, as it will internalize those risks into the financial or the performance of the company.
Great, thank you so much for that, Anna. I think the really one of the things that sort of stood out about with your answer was helping everyone to understand how it might look, right? Because I think that's the biggest question in everyone's head. So thank you very much for that, because I think that sort of concrete, what does it look like, examples, it's just very helpful so that we know that we're not sort of talking about something that's in the air or not very, well, it's becoming more concrete, right? It's on the move, but it's becoming more concrete. And I hope that is helpful to some of our participants who are here today. I'd like to move on to one of our questions, if you don't mind. So
Michele, could I just intervene? I just want to make one other point, because I just wanted to bring up one other very well-known scandal that's, a scandal of the governance variety, and that was, the Odebrecht scandal of a few years ago. And that was a very, flagrant failure of sort of governance issues. And I think I wanted to bring it up because it's useful to understand that the impact of the Odebrecht scandal on a very large company like Petrobras was very interesting, because Petrobras was widely regarded as having very strong, governance models, corporate governance models, and yet those systems seem to fail. So it's really important that when you set these standards, in this case, it's the governance part of it. It's very important that you make sure that it's not just a box checking exercise, that it actually filters into the culture of the organization, and that it actually has real teeth, shall we say, in terms of directing how the company assesses risks and sets its strategy for the future. And I just wanted to mention, as a plug for some of the work we're doing at CIPE, is that one of our areas, which of course you know very well, is some of our anti-corruption compliance work that we're working with companies on, trying to establish priorities on developing anti-corruption strategies and adherence to international anti-corruption standards, that we sort of filter that through help companies filter that through their culture by educating staff and shareholders on the need to pay attention to these standards and to comply with it. So that's an area where we're trying to work with Latin American companies on developing more priority on those sorts of issues. Thanks.
No, great.
Michele, let me just add one thing to John's comment about Petrobras. That's a very interesting one, John. And I believe one word that is on all these aspects is these areas, right, have to be independent, right? This is even when you go to public-owned or state-owned companies, right? This is even worse, right? I believe your point is precisely address what happens with Petrobras. Is not just checking the box, as you mentioned, have an area like that, but this area have to be a state, right? Have to have a state mindset and not a specific government mindset. I don't know if I'm clear in terms of what I mean, right? This has to be long-term and not 4 years, right? That's the term of one president point. So I believe it's critical for these areas to have independence. And I believe this is one of the ways to educate the market, right? And to show to investors that these companies do have good corporate practice when they check the box, they really have it.
Great. Thank you all for all of those really, I think, hopefully helpful perspectives on sort of what ESG means and in terms of sort of compliance and practical sort of use of factors. John is very correct. A lot of our work, in fact, does focus on, in particular, anti-corruption compliance, but also a lot of my work focuses on that as well. We've done a couple of events. So if you go back and find our other Duff and Phelps events, you'll find other events about what it means to have compliance culture. So now I'd like to move on quickly to some of our questions. We've got about 15 minutes left, and we've got 3 really solid questions left. So maybe we could try to answer these in sort of rapid fire. Give ourselves about 5 minutes for each of the questions. And if there are any other questions that come through, perhaps we can answer those through the Q&A function. So I'll move on to the first question, which is, with regard to forecasting, what tools and resources are in practice now? And any thoughts on how the tech community, whether academic or not-for-profit, can help better facilitate these tools?
Well, I can start the conversation on this. This is not necessarily a non-profit approach or a tech approach, but in terms of educating shareholders, one of the largest, in fact, I think the largest asset management company in the world is BlackRock. And if you look at their proxy guidelines and their investment services, you'll see that they have some pretty strong standards in place for looking at ESG standards. A lot of it is centered around 2 things. One is disclosure, that as proxy managers, for investors, they want to see disclosure from companies along the lines of how are they managing ESG guidelines, and number 2, how are they translating that into sort of measurable standards for where the company is going, and how do they connect that to company strategy. And I think that's the biggest single area that needs to happen. There's certainly been a lot of consulting over the years, and particularly with larger companies, on what ESG is. And there's been a lot of work on it done in sort of the corporate social responsibility aspect. But I think the big leap for companies is then learning, and maybe this is pushed, as I said before, from the investor standpoint, that investors requiring these standards to be put into place, connecting that to corporate strategy and where the company is going in the larger picture. How is it part of their strategy? How do you incorporate all of this ESG into a company direction, including, and this is something that we haven't really talked about, but inclusivity, getting a more diverse board of directors, for example, including more women, more racial balance. That can also help a company in sort of the longer term to develop markets in areas that they might not be familiar with, at the board level. So anyway, I just want to get the conversation started on that front. I do think that that there's a big role for nonprofits in this, particularly institutes of directors. We've worked very closely with the Brazilian Institute of Corporate Governance, and they're laying all kinds of interesting guidelines for where ESG can go. So groups like that, directors institutes, and certainly organizations like CIPE, to the degree that we work with, with compliance and anti-corruption types of standards on the G front. Thank you.
Just pinching quickly on what John said, I was going to put that other angle that we are seeing here in Brazil a lot, Michele, that is regulators like CVM, right, and B3, that the stock exchange, that are bringing to discussions with the private equity investors and the EBGC, that's the organization that John mentioned here in Brazil, the governance organization, that there are several stakeholders playing in this area, right? So not only the investors, but we are seeing here in Brazil, particularly these 2 that I mentioned, CVM and B3, discussing with the investors which one are the demands, how they evaluate these demands, right? And how to put together a more, as I mentioned earlier, standardized form of analysis and remuneration of companies that are addressing these ESG terms. Today, in all of the IPOs that we are having here in Brazil, ESG is a critical issue of due diligence of analysis. And if not only talk about IPOs, but also on the M&A, 10 years ago, ESG terms were not in my due diligence list, right? Today, they are a must in any. So I believe there are several players here that are helping putting up the forms and educate not only the private equity, but the individual stockholder, the investor. So giving this full perspective to them.
Mhm.
Anna, please, if you have some thoughts that you wanted to add.
Yeah, regarding sources and tools, I found a very interesting article at Harvard Law School. It's called ESG Reports and Ratings, What They Are, Why They Matter. And there people can find a summary of the main players in the disclosure and in the rankings, the ESG rankings, like Bloomberg, like Corporate Knights, Global 100, Dow Jones Sustainability Index, Sustainalytics, ISS, and there is a very good description of all these tools and how they measure ESG standards, because as we mentioned previously, there is not a common standard now. There's different methodologies, different ways of accounting for these impacts. And I would also like to say that educating shareholders is very important, and also the mapping of the stakeholders it has to be adopted by the corporate boards as a regular tool and as a live tool. It's not that one company can make its stakeholder map and keep it as something that is static. It's dynamic, and each year it has to be revised by experts. Doing an accurate stakeholder mapping is the baseline of a good ESG standard for considering all the stakeholders, how they evolve, applying surveys, getting to know them in the field, and creating the appropriate vehicles of communication so that the corporate board establishes a very a strong connection with the stakeholders. I think that is the main important basis of this. Thanks.
Thank you, Anna. You very adeptly moved us on to our next question. So thank you so much. So the question, I'll read it, is that sort of given the fact that we're talking about long-term perspectives, the participant was wondering about efforts being made to educate shareholders. And Anna very pointed out, I think very astutely, that education sort of is bifold, at least in a certain way, right? That we need appropriate stakeholder mappings and then, appropriate communication about sort of the information that comes out of those mappings to help sort of guide where we're going. I wonder if either John or Alexandre, if you have other perspectives on that about how we might go about educating shareholders and investors.
Well, let me just make one mention. One of the real challenges in Latin America is that many companies have a pretty strong controlling shareholder interest. So when you're talking about educating shareholders, really the most important group to be able to try to educate on these topics and to create demand for robust standards are the controlling shareholders. And that obviously can be done, the largest companies can be done through, certainly through different sort of consulting standards. I mean, there are a lot of consultants out there who can provide, insights into what a larger company can do. I think it's, for smaller, players, particularly in supply chains, companies who supply the larger companies with products and services. I think the role of nonprofits can be really important, in that area. but convincing the controlling shareholders, and maybe Alex has something to say about that, is a huge task. I think the world is moving in that direction, but getting them on board will be an important part of getting the larger companies to really move on this topic.
Yes, John, I agree with you, and you highlight an interesting point about how control of companies are concentrated in our region, right? Even when you go to public traded companies, right, there is a controlling group, a controlling shareholder in most part of them. So this is, I believe, the markets are in a different level of maturity when you address that, and particularly in our region. I believe another point I was thinking when you mentioned, Michele, about how to educate the stakeholders, right? And I don't know if I'm thinking out of the box here, but what I'm seeing is that at the end of the day, who is educating the stakeholders is the market, right? Because the consumers are demanding for products and services, and that the companies at least address how they are analyzing ESG terms. So it's going to be a chicken and egg situation, I believe, because at the end of the day, if putting myself as a stakeholder, right, the market's demanding products, right, and just take one example here. If you look at the cattle production, right, Brazil is strong cattle production and meat exporter, right? If you don't have a tracking of the meat, if you don't have the whole process under the ESG terms, today your product is no longer competitive, right? So for this, I believe is the best education, right? Is to be competitive, right? I do have to address the point as in a complete solution, right? I believe if you go for some sectors, there is a oligopoly, a monopoly is a little bit harder, right, to go on that. But if you go for particular consumer products, right, the market is educating the stakeholders. They have to move on that. And this is not only for the mid-size, the middle market company. The multinationals are doing acquisitions of smaller operations that are green for one aspect, or they have the environmental aspect on the other one, or the social aspect on the other as another topic, because this is a quicker and safer way to enter, right, and address what the market is demanding. So I believe the education comes from the consumer, right? It will come more and more from the consumer. And I go back to my initial point, and then I stop talking about how the pandemic has accelerated this perception and how companies are going to be evaluated about the behavior they had last year and this year.
Michele, can I just interject one quick thing that I didn't think about when I was talking before? The other really big group I think that's important to pay attention to are institutional investors. And institutional investors play a huge role, pension funds and other sorts of institutional investors are hugely important. In classic corporate governance circles, which I've worked with a lot, appealing to institutional investors has been a big part of trying to establish stronger corporate governance standards. Institutional investors don't tend to want to take a very activist role in how companies are managed, but they can serve as a conduit. They would be influenced by the BlackRocks of the world, but then they're also responsive to their individual shareholders, you and I, who have a stake in our pension fund and what it does. And that could be a way to educate consumers and sort of small shareholders through pension funds on why these standards are important.
Those are some really great perspectives. I think, Andre, in sort of your last comments and talking about who's influencing whom, right? We know there are some actors, institutional investors. We know that we have consumers who are playing a role here. We know that we have NGOs, and then we have some really great ideas about sort of how all of that might look from Anna. So I think the last question that we have, and we have about 3 minutes left, so maybe we can talk about it a little bit, and we've already alluded to it, is the way that consumers are sort of maybe driving some of this. I wonder if either Anna or John, if you have any thoughts about sort of the role that communities and that consumers really are playing in driving some of the ESG compliance. Is it as much as we think, or is it maybe just specifically in this context of the pandemic? I wonder if you have any thoughts to share with us as we wrap up.
Well, I think that consumers' role is becoming more and more important. The generations, the new generations like the millennials and centennials are changing the configuration of the relationship between the companies and the customer base. New technologies as well are allowing a more horizontal relationship, and the speed of the interactions between the companies and the customers is posing new challenges for the suppliers, and that has to be documented and quantified for decision-making purposes, because the customers are one of the most important stakeholders for a company, obviously. And sometimes new technologies allow also that customers may be also suppliers. So the relationship may become more complex than in the past. For example, in digital markets, that is very, very common, that a customer becomes a supplier at programming apps, or establishing a different relationship with the digital global players like Google or Facebook. So this very rapid shift that a customer can make between being a passive agent towards an active agent in relationship with the company can change the map of the decision making. So the boards have to take decisions more rapidly in order to maintain a good relationship with their customers.
Great. Thank you so much, Anna, for your thoughtful insights on sort of what the role of the customer and up and coming Gen Zers and millennials are adding sort of to this conversation. I attended a really interesting seminar last week, and this was exactly the topic: how consumers and what portions of consumers maybe are driving some of this. We are right at the top of the hour, so we have to conclude. And so I apologize if we have not had an opportunity to answer your question, but hopefully we have, either indirectly or directly. I would like to thank John, Anna, and Alexandre for joining us today. And before we wrap up, I'd like to turn it back to Mark so that he might give us a few closing remarks. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Michele. And thank you once again to our fantastic panel and to everyone for joining us. And once more, thank you very much to Duff Phelps for this partnership. Please stay tuned if you enjoyed the discussion this morning. We are going to continue our series. There are some other regions of the world that we're planning to look at in upcoming discussions. And thanks once again for joining us today to talk about the role of ESG in post-pandemic recovery in Latin America and the Caribbean.